All right, how's everyone doing? Excuse me. All right, so this week we're talking about conflict and radical theories. These could also be classified as conflict theories within criminology, right? And in some ways, we kind of hinted at these theories last week when we talked about labeling theory, right? So let me kind of back up and talk about that before we get to these. If you listened to the lecture from last week and did the readings and stuff like that, and like labeling theory talked about how a label is applied to someone. Sometimes that label sticks, sometimes it doesn't, right? And labeling theory really focuses upon processes, right? And it doesn't go into a lot of details about how some people are able to attach that label more successfully and stigmatize people, and that label sticks and it changes the way that people view them, right? In fact, in order to explain that, you really need some of the theoretical ideas, this type of thinking that occurs in this chapter, right? And you might have already thought, labels like delinquent or criminal more likely to be applied to certain races, certain classes, certain ethnicities, certain genders even, right? And some people have the ability to resist those labels, right? And not be defined publicly as that criminal or delinquent or whatever the case might be, right? Stigmatized status. Now you've kind of gotten out of labeling theory and you've entered into another way of thinking about crime, and that's all of these different theories from the conflict approach, right? And if you were taught by me intro, and I'm not sure, they might have used different terminology if you took intro to sociology from someone else, but you probably learned that there's like these three perspectives or approaches or paradigms, sometimes they're called. There's the structural functionalism, right? There's the conflict, right? And this is consistent with that tradition within sociology. Of course, this is criminological theory, but it develops out of that conflict perspective, right? And within that conflict approach, there's different conflict theories, right? There are some that mostly look at inequality between different classes. Karl Marx is a great example of that, but also Max Weber. There are others that look at conflict and inequality between different races. W.E.B. Du Bois is a great example. And there are also other theories that look at conflict between males and females, and we typically call that feminist theory, right? So this is kind of the theoretical tradition that all these criminological theories develop out of these larger sociological theories and social theories, right? All right, so this kind of, place these things in their proper perspective and tradition of how they kind of develop over time, right? That larger picture of how all these things fill in, right? And all of those, there's great amount of emphasis. There's lots of thinking about inequality, right? Now, what the most important inequality is, whether it's class inequality, whether it's racial inequality or ethnic inequality, or whether it's gender inequality, kind of, determines which type of conflict theory. All right, so with all that being said, let's start talking about this, right? All of these theories are radical in this sense, right? They question the status quo, attempt to change the world, right? Attempt to bring about greater equality, justice, right? And that, in a lot of ways, is different than everything that's come before this, right? The traditional role of the scientists, or the traditional model of the scientists, that was borrowed from other natural sciences, right? And that's the model that we see in most structural functionalism, right? And Merton's theory, to some extent, differential association and things like that. Like the scientist is kind of thought of as a neutral observer, right? And they just observe the way that the world is, but they don't really try to change it. Not the scientists, right? Now, engineers take things that scientists use and then they try to change the world, but the scientist is just supposed to be discovering these generalizable laws about the universe, right? And so at first, when we did what Comte said and engaged in positivistic research on society as well as on crime, right? There was this common idea that, we just study society. We don't try to change it, right? And there was one fellow that came along and he said, this is nonsense. Why would we learn all of this stuff about society and then not try to improve it, right? That person was Karl Marx, right? And he says, well, he has a famous quote about philosophers up to this point have only interpreted the world, right? The point is to change it, right? And he had his ideas about how to change it. W.B. Du Bois had other ideas about how to change it. Feminist theories have their ideas, right? And they can vary to some extent, but they all seek to bring about a more just world, right? They can disagree about the means of achieving that and stuff, but they all have that in common, right? And they see inequality as a central problem with society, right? And that we would all be better off if there was less inequality, and there would be less crime if there was less inequality, right? Now, Merton agreed with that somewhat, but he's not from this perspective. He's more from structural functionalism. Now, a lot of theories before this, kind of like everyone knows who the criminals are, there's vast consensus about what's a crime and what's not a crime, and most conflict theorists or radical theorists disagree with this, right? There's not vast consensus. And, how something becomes defined as criminal and how we enforce the law and, go into neighborhoods and round up some people and how we ignore others and stuff like that, can all be explained by differences in power, right? Resources, power, status, differences in class, race, and gender, right? And they don't see this as all the result of like consensus, but they see it as a result of conflict where some people are in dominant positions and other people are in subordinate positions, right? So we think about like how do laws get passed, right? And what are the attributes of our legislators, right? They're not, representative of the population at whole, right? Much more likely to be rich, affluent, much more likely to be white, much more likely to be male, right? And if you don't believe me, go look at all the senators and congressmen in Montgomery or in Washington, right? And they come, from the elite. They come from the more likely to come from the dominant groups, not the subordinate groups in society, right? And when they make certain behavior, it's often the behavior that's seen as typical, stereotypical even, of poor people, of minorities, and of men, right? Yeah. When that's a little bit different than you might expect. Typically, it's always a subordinate group. Now, men tend to be in positions, and we are the dominant group. But when it comes to crime, things often kind of work in the reverse order, right? Because most crime is committed by males, and most people fear males more than females and stuff like that, right? Yeah, and so, if you go look at the makeup of people in Montgomery, in the Capitol, or you go look at the makeup of people in Congress and Senate and Washington, D.C., note their attributes: race, gender, and class. Then go to people that are kind of on the losing end of this system in prisons, right? Do they have similar class backgrounds, racial backgrounds, gender? No, not at all, right? Not at all, right? And that's a powerful indicator. There's all this stuff about inequality going on that explains these who you see in these places, who you see in these other places, right? Prisons or Congress, right? So they really problematize crime. They don't take it for granted, right? A lot of structural functions in that tradition. Everybody knows who the criminals are, right? Yeah, and they really problematize these things, right? They are very critical of the existing state of relations, right? The status quo, the way that things are, right? Very critical of that. That's, what are they critical of? What are critical theorists critical of? Everything, right? Particularly inequality. And they think that we should change society, right? And that would be progress. That would be improvement, right? And so they seek a total transformation of society. Sometimes even revolutionary change, in the example of Karl Marx, right? Well, some more radical feminists, some more radical race theorists, right? But some are kind of not so they don't prefer a radical transformation, more like a little piecemeal, right? Baby steps toward a new society rather than one big step or revolution, right? All right. Central to the way that all conflict theorists is there's inequality, right? There's differences, and we compete for resources in a world where resources are scarce, right? All conflict theories assume that there are important cleavages in society or inequality, right? For Marx and for Bonger, who is talked about as kind of like the first Marxist criminologist, it's differences between the two groups that are not equal to the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? Proletariat, well, let me start with the bourgeoisie. They own and control the means of production, the factories, the capital, the tools, everything, right? The proletariat, on the other hand, own only their ability to provide labor, and to sell their labor to the capitalists. They need each other, but it's a rather exploitive relationship. One has the upper hand and exploits the other. It's an agreement that they enter into, but one person has the upper hand and one exploits the other, right? For someone like W.E. Du Bois, that's not the important type of inequality. It's differences between whites and black people, right? And then for feminists, they might agree that there's other sources of inequality, but they will tend to believe that the most important are the differences between men and women, males and females, right? they all will believe that those in the dominant position, the more powerful position, will use the criminal justice system and all means of social control, right, to benefit those in the dominant position at the expense of those in the subordinate position, right? So Marx believes that the rich and powerful will use the criminal justice system to benefit themselves, to maintain the status quo at the expense of poor people, right? And there's, a long list of laws like vagrancy laws, loitering laws. These are laws that rich people don't really get arrested for them, right? They're laws to control the behavior of poor people, right? Loitering laws are like, what does it mean to loiter? Where you're not working for someone, you're not being exploited by an employer, and you're not buying something, right? So you're of no use to capitalists. And because of that, they passed, during the Industrial Revolution, they passed laws against vagrancy and loitering and stuff, right? I mean, laws against homeless people, right? Rich people, those laws don't apply to them, right? And and to some extent, the war against drugs, right? When we decided to fight a war against drugs, and we didn't always fight a war against drugs. For most of American history, there were no laws really against possession of all sorts of drugs that are now legal, cocaine, heroin, all these things, right? But we decided in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? That's kind of when the war against drugs, that we're going to define possession of these things as criminal, and we're going to attach these legal sanctions, time in prison, right? And when they went out, police and prosecutors, and mostly who they arrested were poor minorities. They arrested some white people, but it was disproportionately, right? The people who were punished and punished severely were poor people, racial minorities, right? Yeah, I mean, there's consensus about that, right? And that tends to be how our criminal justice system works, right? Because if you are more affluent and you know people in powerful positions and stuff like that, you can hire a better lawyer, right? You can influence people, right? You can call in favors, right? For you or for your children if they're caught possessing drugs, right? And you can escape a good bit of those sanctions. Or just, living in one neighborhood than another, right? You can afford to live in a better neighborhood. The chances of you getting arrested are drastically different than if you live in a poor neighborhood, right? And that's, in a country like ours that is capitalist and to some extent marked by these racial distinctions and marked by patriarchy and stuff like that, that's how these things tend to play out, right? Yeah. And I hope you see that. And, if you don't agree with those things, it's hard for me to convince you. You don't, because there are obviously all sorts of evidence of racial bias, class bias, gender bias within the criminal justice system, within the court system, within the correctional system, right? We might disagree about how much bias, right? But certainly reasonable people agree that it does exist, right? All right. Yeah, central to all these things is that inequality is the major driver or cause of crime, right? That crime is a result of society marked by economic and political conflict, right? Political conflict just means there's dominant groups and there's subordinate groups, right? And some of those maintain power. Montgomery, Washington, D.C., right? Police, judges, and some of them do not, right? And the powerful will define certain behaviors as criminal in order to protect their interests, right? And when they go out and enforce laws, right, they will tend to enforce the laws in poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. Now, they could do something else, right? I mean, we could decide not to fight drug wars and instead fight wars against white-collar crime and tax evasion and, economic fraud. But we don't, do we? Right? Occasionally we might, round up some white-collar criminals and make an example of them. But for the most part, we do not look for the criminal behavior of rich people, powerful people, right? Yeah. So if you see the world and think about crime through this lens, right, then it has certain policy implications, right? If you want to reduce crime, reduce inequality, right? Since it's the major driver, the cause of crime, right? If there's economic and political inequality, then if you reduce it, that should go a long way toward reducing crime, right? That's the obvious policy implications of this, right? Some of the things that we do, fighting crime, right? Like imprisoning more and more people, right? During the drug war, did we get to a point where no one was using drugs? No, right? And some people argue that if our criminal justice system and our correction system often produces more inequality, right? And if it does that, you should expect more crime, right? That's, we do these things, we think we're fighting crime, but oftentimes when we punish criminal behavior, we're making that behavior more likely to persist into the future, right? That it can be criminogenic. It can not decrease crime. It does not deter, but it increases crime. That's an argument that most conflict and radical theorists Brathwaite talked about that too, right? We can do reintegrative or disintegrative shaming. In the past, in the United States, we've been mostly doing disintegrative shaming that increases future criminal behavior, right? All right. The best example, and the one that's probably talked about the most, is Richard Quinney's. He's there were lots of Marxist criminologists back in the 60s, and there are far less now, right? But Richard Quinney is one of these people that has continued to be a criminologist that's heavily influenced by the work of Marx, also William Bonner and stuff like that. Back in the 60s, every sociology department, every large one, would have people that were heavily influenced by Marx. That's not really the case anymore, right? For a variety of reasons, right? It's just, I don't know, theories fall out of favor, and But Richard Quinney, and he talks about a number of the things, and he does use some kind of technical language, which I always kind of found a little bit surprising for, someone that's heavily influenced by Marx. But he talks about crime is officially determined in two powerful ways. Formulate the laws that get written, right? And also how the law is applied to people, right? So we've already kind of talked about formulation and tendency for, like, I have studied drugs most of my life, so a lot of my examples will come from drugs and stuff like that. Pretty much every time that a drug has been banned and criminalized, it was because in the minds of legislators, it was used by this racial minority or this poor people or this ethnicity, That was true with cocaine and Mexicans and opium with Asian immigrants that worked on the railroad in California and stuff. And, I suppose meth. There's always been a kind of stereotype of that as poor white people, but it's poor. That's the marginalized part of that, right? And kind of, at the beginning of concern about meth, it was like kind of hillbillies, people in the Appalachian and stuff like that. Poor white people, right? And and then once the law is passed, then we, police officers, sheriffs, all law enforcement go out and they look for the people that are violating this. And where you look for crime, you will find it, right? You look in poor neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods, you'll tend to find it. And if you don't look in more affluent neighborhoods, you won't find it there, right? And that's the application of the law, right? And this is how these things are done. This is inherently about politics and power, right? There's no avoiding it, right? I mean, if you think about drugs, and I might have talked about this before, it's like, a lot of people think we made all these drugs illegal because they were harmful to society. Well, the most harmful drug is cigarettes. We didn't make it illegal, right? So that kind of flies in the face of that argument, doesn't it? And it kills, close to 500,000 people, more than fentanyl, much more, 5 times more than fentanyl per year, right? All right. The next thing that that Quinney talks about is behavior patterns is relative. There's always police and criminals, this kind of cat and mouse type thing, right? A reciprocal relationship. Those defined as criminal. They're two groups and they have contrary interests and various amounts of. There's a reciprocal relationship, and and over time, like labeling theory suggests that people who are defined as criminal will often begin to think of themselves and identify as criminals, right? And and then the next part, and this is something that he borrows from Karl Marx, is the existence of ideology, right? A set of ideas that justifies all of this, right? An ideology of crime, according to Quinney, is constructed and diffused by the dominant class to secure its hegemony, its power over other people, right? This simply means that the powerful will control the dominant ideas in order to remain in a position of power, right? And, stories about crime, media, books, television shows, right? A lot of that is about here are the good guys and here are the bad guys. It's kind of a moral education, right? Or, DARE programs in high school. It's like, oh, these are, the good guys, they never use drugs, and bad guys, always use drugs and stuff like that, right? Later you find out, man, sometimes the good guys do bad stuff, and sometimes the bad guys aren't really that bad, right? It's a lot messier than the ideology would suggest, right? And some people are able to shape this ideology much better, right? Because they're in their positions where they control the media, right? And they use that to their advantage, right? Yeah, I mean, think about, like, from time to time there has been calls to end the war against drugs. Now, those people in power, like sheriffs, law enforcement, judges, get tough on crime, on drug crimes, like this kind of punitive minded politicians. They'll convince everyone it's going to be the end of the world, and society will just crumble if we legalize marijuana, right? Well, I mean, for the longest time, you could smoke marijuana, right? It's only until, recently, right? I mean, in the big picture view of things, did we start arresting large numbers of people for this, right? For most of American history, people were not arrested for this. People, for all drugs, they were not sent to prison. They might spend a little time sobering up in jail, right? But, people will try to convince you that this would be the end of the world if we legalize any of this drug, right? Although we did just fine for hundreds of years in the United States with no laws controlling these drugs, right? And that's also like, war against drugs. Has that improved inequality or exacerbated it? I think it's exacerbated it, right? If you talk to anyone that's gone to drug court, right? They fine you, they fee you, right? You pee in this cup, you got to pay money for that, right? Jump through these hoops for a number of years and stuff like that. And in some ways, it's become a way of taxing people through fines and fees, right? All right. Yeah, that's Quinny's ideas. Let me talk a little bit about feminism, right? Now, you might be thinking, feminist criminologists, this never heard of that. Well, let me tell you. At one point, I was kind of that opinion, and one of my mentors at Mississippi State, major professor, right, on my dissertation, chair of my dissertation, she's a feminist criminologist, right? And I took her class. And I was like, I don't know that much about feminist criminology. It's like, where are you about to learn it, right? And I was quite impressed. I was like, oh man, I just didn't know, right? There are all sorts of issues of gender that happen in the criminal justice system, right? In fact, like every theory that we've talked about has really been a theory about men's criminal behavior, right? And up until this point, we have really not talked about women. And so feminist criminology is like, where are the women, right? Where are the women criminals? Where are the women judges? Where are the women police officers? The women correctional officers? And what are their social experiences like, right? That's kind of the beginning of feminist criminologists, is that like we acted like we were talking about all people, but we were really just theorizing on females, right? And when you like, where are the women, right? And you start studying them. A lot of people are of the opinion that the causes for criminal behavior for females are drastically different than the ones for males, right? And this kind of, there's something called pathways into crime, and they are gendered, right? The causes for criminal behavior among women are different than they are among males. We can't just take all the same theories and apply them to men and boys, right? One of the most striking differences between men and women is women are much more likely to have a history of victimhood, a history of abuse and neglect at the hands of their parents, at the hands of men dominating them in romantic relationships and marriage, right? And they're often not the people that instigate crime, but they're the person that they date, right? Or sometimes their parent, right? Their father will kind of recruit them into their criminal behavior, right? And and so it's just, if you go interview females in prisons, you get lots of really sad stories, verifiable stories about abuse and neglect and series of exploitive relationships, sexually exploitive relationships, right? That are not as common among men in prison, and certainly are not as common among women that are not sentenced to prison, right? That's what they call gendered pathways into crime, right? Yeah. The other thing that feminists point out, and this is, most of criminology for the longest time really narrowly focused just upon the perpetrator and the characteristics of that perpetrator, right? And we just didn't look at the victims, right? And feminists when you do look at the victims, you find oftentimes it's females, right? And we should study that as well, right? Why do the victims tend to be females quite often? For some crimes more than others, right? But certainly things like rape and sexual assault, women are much more likely to be the victims of those things, typically at the hands of men, right? And this, of course, is something that feminists have been very interested in, right? And have been successful in changing to a great extent how seriously we take rape, right? How seriously we take domestic violence, right? How seriously we take stalking, right? There was a time before the feminist movement that all these things, were not really thought of as what the criminal justice system should do, right? And, a man beat his wife and the police came, they're like, oh, it's your wife and, it's your household. And yeah, only much later do we start passing laws like, if there's a mark on anyone's body, someone's going to jail for the night, right? And that was in large part to the accomplishments of the feminists, right? Yeah. Another thing that feminists has pointed out is I guess I had this, I thought that feminist criminologists, or if you take a class, like I took a class, Gender and Crime, right? And I learned a lot of this stuff during that class, right? Really eye-opening for me. And if you took a class on gender and crime, you'd probably think, oh, we're going to talk a lot about women and stuff like that. But men have a gender too, right? And a lot of times, I would argue, right, and feminists would argue too, when men engage in criminal behavior, they are acting out masculine roles, right? So it's these ideas of masculinity, right, that lead, this heightened sense of masculinity, and you can't do that to me, you got to treat me like a man and stuff like that. That leads to bullying, that leads to fighting, that leads to homicides, right? And so, men have a gender. And a lot of times when men engage in violent behavior, it's about, I have to defend my manhood, right? And he insulted my manhood and stuff like that, right? And feminists think that's really important. I think that's really important too, right? That's a really important idea within prisons is like, you can't treat me like a punk or like a sissy or, other derogatory words for someone that's not completely, a masculine male, right? And if you do, I will commit violence against you, right? Yeah. And that's kind of how masculinity can lead to crime, this heightened sense of masculinity. Men often have, and that's more common among poor neighborhoods, more common among less educated people. It's more common in some cultures, right, that have like an emphasis on machismo, right? In a lot of Latin cultures, right? Yeah, that's all feminism, right? And they do have some really important contributions to the study of crime, right? And I was not taught most of this stuff when I was an undergrad. I had to wait until I got to graduate school. And I'm trying to correct that in this class, to expose you to feminist theory and point out they have some really important things that have changed the way that we think about crime. Really important contributions, right? And I wished I would have learned this earlier in my career, right? Because it's very interesting. It's very interesting even for men like me, right? They've made a number of really valuable contributions, right? All right. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and talk about kind of, men and, there's a hierarchy, man's man, certainly in high schools, there's this hierarchy, right? Of the kind of alpha male or whatever, right? And, the person that's the opposite of that, and where people rank, and people, typically men are taught to kind of rise up in this hierarchy, right? And one way of doing that is commit violence against people that rank lower in that hierarchy of masculinity, right? And committing acts exploitive, sexually exploitive, financially exploitive, physically abusive toward females is a way often to rise up through that hierarchy of masculinity, you might call it, right? Now, there are all sorts of different schools of feminist thought. I'm not going to go into those, right? Because that is kind of more typical of what you would learn in graduate school. We're kind of just, scratching the surface, so to speak, right? Yeah, and I have a number of slides about all these different types, postmodernists and multiracial feminists and stuff like that. It's interesting. You can certainly go through those slides on your own, pay attention as you read the readings, but I'll keep this lecture kind of brief this week. All right, I hope that you've learned a lot, and I hope that you now see the value of these radical theories, these conflict, and you see how they're different from everything that came before, right? And they make important contributions and pose and answer new questions, right? And have new policy implications, right? Yeah. And always found them really interesting, right? Just because they're not mainstream, right? That they do look at things in a radically different way than all the other theories. And I'm kind of drawn to that, I suppose. That's my, sentiment relevance, as we talked about in the first reading. Y'all have a nice day. and I'll get this video posted soon.